His 6-year-old daughter called him with a phrase that froze his blood. She had found her mother, alive, but in a coma. Michael Henderson's office was perched high above the city, a sleek glass tower that seemed untouchable by the chaos of the streets below. Inside, everything reflected his status: polished mahogany furniture, modern art that whispered of wealth and power, and the kind of silence that comes only when others are too intimidated to disturb you. He sat behind his desk in a light blue suit, his dark hair perfectly groomed, his piercing blue eyes scanning the latest reports projected on the screen before him. For years he had lived like this, a man defined by control, calculation, and certainty. He had risen from nothing to become one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, and though his world was built on speed and competition, he believed he had mastered the art of keeping emotion at bay. But all of that began to unravel with one phone call. The phone on his desk rang with a sharpness that startled him more than it should have. Michael answered, expecting the calm voice of his assistant or perhaps another executive eager for his approval. Instead, what came through was the trembling, fragile voice of his 6-year-old daughter, Emma. There was a quiver in her tone, the kind that immediately stripped away his composure. "Daddy," she whispered, her words broken by tiny sobs, "I found Mom. She's in the hospital. She won't wake up." For a moment, Michael's mind refused to process the words. His daughter had said something impossible, something that contradicted everything he thought he knew. The room seemed to tilt, the glass walls pressing in as if the world itself was collapsing around him. He rose from his chair so suddenly that it scraped across the polished floor, toppling backward as he clutched the phone tighter. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out the sound of Emma's small voice as she repeated her words. He forced himself to ask questions, his voice shaking despite all his efforts to control it. Where was she? Who had told her this? What hospital? Emma's answers came in halting fragments, but each one confirmed the same unthinkable truth. His daughter was not playing a game, not inventing a story. She had seen something real, and that reality threatened to destroy the carefully constructed life he thought he had secured for both of them. As he ended the call and rushed toward the elevator, his reflection in the mirrored walls caught his eye. The image staring back at him was not the unshakable titan of industry but a man stripped bare, his eyes wide with fear, his hands trembling as if every ounce of strength had abandoned him. Memories assaulted him in jagged flashes: the day Sarah, his wife, had disappeared without a trace 6 years ago, the endless nights when he convinced himself she was gone forever, the way he had shielded Emma from the truth, telling her that her mother had been taken by fate. Now, with just a few words from his daughter, everything he believed was shattered. The elevator doors opened, and he rushed into the lobby, ignoring the greetings of staff who looked on in surprise at their normally composed boss moving with such frantic urgency. Outside, the city blurred around him as he ordered his driver to take him to the hospital Emma had named. He sat in the back seat, staring out the tinted window, his chest tight, his thoughts a chaotic storm of disbelief, fear, and a strange, dangerous hope he did not want to acknowledge. If what Emma had said was true, if Sarah was truly alive, then the life he had built on the assumption of her absence was about to be torn apart. For the first time in years, Michael Henderson, the man who prided himself on never losing control, felt utterly powerless, held hostage by a phrase spoken in the frightened voice of his little girl. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and faintly of old paint, the kind of place where time seemed to lose its shape. Michael strode through the wide glass doors with a speed that startled the staff at the reception desk, his presence commanding attention even without a word. The light blue suit that usually projected calm authority was wrinkled from his hurried movements, and his blue eyes, once sharp with focus, now darted frantically from sign to sign as he searched for the ward his daughter had named. He moved past gurneys, nurses, and visitors without really seeing them, his mind fixed on one thought: if Emma was right, everything he thought he knew about his life was about to collapse. When he finally reached the room, he stopped in the doorway, unable to breathe for a moment. The steady beeping of machines filled the air, and there, lying motionless on the hospital bed, was a woman whose face he knew as well as his own. Sarah. Her golden hair framed her pale features, her eyes closed, her lips colorless against the stark white of the pillow. Tubes and wires surrounded her, an orchestra of medical devices keeping her tethered to life. It was as if time had reversed and delivered back what had been stolen from him 6 years ago, but in a form that was fragile, broken, and unbearably still. Then his gaze shifted, and he saw Emma. She stood beside the bed in her yellow dress, small hands clutching Sarah's limp fingers as though she could pour her love into them by sheer will. Her blue eyes, red from crying, lit up when she saw him, but her voice trembled when she spoke. "Daddy, it's her. I found her. This is Mommy." The word struck him harder than any boardroom defeat or financial loss ever could. Emma's innocence made the moment even more unbearable, because in her heart there was no doubt, no hesitation. She had recognized her mother instantly, and in that certainty Michael felt the weight of all the years of silence and carefully chosen half-truths he had built around her. He stepped inside, each movement heavy, his polished shoes clicking softly against the linoleum as though mocking the chaos of his thoughts. He came to stand beside his daughter, his hand hovering over Sarah's face but not quite daring to touch. He wanted to feel the warmth of her skin, to prove to himself that this was not some cruel illusion, yet fear gripped him. Fear that if he reached out, she might vanish, leaving him with nothing but the cold emptiness he had lived with for years. Emma looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me she was alive?" The question sliced through him. He opened his mouth but found no words, because the truth was unbearable. He had truly believed Sarah was gone forever. He had buried her not in the ground, but in his memory, telling himself it was the only way to survive. And now here she was, breathing but unconscious, the mother Emma had dreamed of, the woman he had loved and lost, lying within arm's reach yet impossibly far away. A nurse entered quietly, checking the monitors with a practiced efficiency, offering Michael a clinical explanation of Sarah's condition. "Severe head trauma. She's been in a coma since the accident. Stable, but the prognosis is uncertain." The words blurred in his ears, reduced to meaningless fragments. All he could see was Sarah, caught between life and death, and Emma, clinging to her as though her small hands alone could keep her tethered to this world. Michael sank into the chair beside the bed, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that had chased him from the moment of the call. He took Sarah's hand gently, the coolness of her skin a jarring reminder of the distance between them, and for the first time in years, tears filled his eyes. Emma leaned against him, clutching both their hands together in her small grasp, as if determined to bridge the gap between past and present. In that moment, Michael realized that nothing he had built, no wealth, no empire, could protect him from what lay before him. He had stepped into a reality where power was meaningless, and only love, fragile and desperate, could hold them together. Michael did not sleep that night. He sat in the hard plastic chair by Sarah's bed long after the nurses dimmed the lights in the ward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the faint rise and fall of her chest. The steady rhythm of the machine should have been comforting, but each beep only deepened the gnawing uncertainty that consumed him. He had always been a man who thrived on facts, on numbers and contracts and clear results, but here he was faced with something that defied logic. His wife, the woman he had once loved with everything he had, the woman he had grieved as lost, was alive but unreachable, her mind locked away behind closed doors he could not break through. The more he stared at her face, pale yet still achingly familiar, the more memories came flooding back, her laughter on summer evenings, the way she used to tilt her head when she was curious, the quiet strength she carried even in their worst arguments. Those images clashed violently with the sight of her lying motionless, and the contradiction tore at him until his chest ached. The weight of Emma's presence beside him made the moment even harder to bear. She had fallen asleep in the chair at his side, her small hand still resting on Sarah's arm as if she feared letting go would mean losing her again. The innocence of her belief that everything could be fixed if she simply stayed close cut Michael deeper than any accusation could. For years he had built his daughter's world on the foundation of absence, convincing her and himself that Sarah was gone forever. Now Emma's unwavering certainty that this was her mother forced him to confront the fact that he had been wrong, and not just wrong but blind, perhaps even willfully so. By dawn, when the first pale light crept through the blinds, Michael felt hollowed out, as though the life he had built was nothing more than a shell around a truth he had refused to face. He asked the doctors for details, his voice rough from exhaustion. They explained that Sarah had been brought in after a devastating car accident. She had no identification on her, and by the time her name was discovered in the medical records, she had already slipped into the coma. With no known family stepping forward, she had remained here, a nameless patient to most of the staff, kept alive by machines but with little hope of recovery. Michael listened in silence, each word both a revelation and a dagger. She had been here all along, breathing in the same city, while he mourned her as dead. He, a man with the resources to move governments and command industries, had never found her. The guilt hit him like a tidal wave. He replayed the years in his mind, every birthday Emma had spent without her mother, every night she had cried quietly in her room, asking questions he had answered with half-truths. He had believed he was protecting her, but now he wondered if he had simply been protecting himself from a reality too painful to face. If Sarah had been alive, if there had been even the slightest chance of finding her, then his grief had not only been misplaced but selfish. The thought was unbearable. And yet, beneath the crushing guilt and the storm of questions, there flickered something far more dangerous: hope. He caught himself watching for the smallest sign, a twitch of her eyelids, a movement of her hand, anything that would mean she could come back to them. That hope terrified him because it was fragile, built on nothing but longing and Emma's unwavering faith. He knew too well what it meant to cling to hope that might never be fulfilled, and he feared what it would do to Emma if her mother never woke. Still, even as he tried to suppress it, the hope grew stronger with every moment he sat beside her. As night fell again, Michael reached for Sarah's hand, his fingers brushing against hers with a tenderness he hadn't allowed himself in years. "Where have you been?" he whispered, his voice breaking in the quiet room. Emma stirred beside him, half awake, and murmured, "She'll hear you, Daddy." "I know she will." The simplicity of her faith, the absolute conviction in her small voice, sent a shiver through him. In that moment, Michael realized that Emma's words carried more power than his doubt. And though he still feared the pain of disappointment, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, his daughter was right. The days that followed blurred together, measured not by clocks or calendars but by the rhythm of machines and the sound of Emma's voice filling the sterile hospital room. Michael found himself living in a world he no longer recognized, a world where his empire of glass towers and endless board meetings seemed like a hollow illusion compared to the fragile reality of a woman in a coma and a little girl who refused to give up hope. Every morning, he would arrive at the hospital still wearing the armor of his light blue suit, as though clinging to the identity of the powerful man he had always been, but each night he would leave stripped of that facade, his shoulders bent under the invisible weight of helplessness. Emma became the lifeline of the room. She would sit cross-legged on the chair beside the bed, her yellow dress bright against the dull white sheets, and talk to her mother as though the silence between them did not exist. She told her about school, about the friends she had made and the games they played, about the books she loved and the dreams she had. Sometimes she would sing, her small voice rising and falling with an innocence that seemed to cut through the mechanical beeping of the monitors. And every time Michael listened, torn between admiration and agony, he realized that his daughter carried a strength he had never known. Where he saw only wires and stillness, she saw a mother listening, waiting, ready to come back. But the strength that Emma carried also cast a harsh light on Michael's own weakness. He struggled with an inner battle that grew fiercer each day. He wanted to believe as she did, to embrace the faith that Sarah could return to them, yet the logical, hardened part of him whispered that hope would only lead to heartbreak. He remembered the betrayal he had felt when Sarah disappeared, the night spent wondering if she had abandoned them by choice, the anger that had slowly curdled into resignation. Now those feelings warred with a new, dangerous longing. What if she opened her eyes and he had the chance to ask her why? What if she could explain the silence that had haunted them for 6 years? He knew those answers might destroy him, but he also knew he could not stop himself from wanting them. In the quiet hours after Emma fell asleep, curled in the chair with her small hand still resting on Sarah's arm, Michael would allow himself to stare at his wife's face. Her beauty was still there, softened by time and shadowed by suffering, but unmistakable. He imagined her eyes opening suddenly, looking at him with the same fire they had once held, and the thought was almost unbearable. He whispered words he had never spoken aloud in all the years of her absence, apologies, confessions, desperate questions, and each time he wondered if somewhere inside the silence, she could hear him. The doctors came and went, their updates cautious and clinical. She is stable, they said, but there is no significant change. Those words became a kind of prison, locking Michael into a state of waiting without direction, of hope without evidence. He despised how powerless he felt, a man who had bent entire markets to his will now sitting helpless at the side of a bed, unable to change the only outcome that mattered. And yet, despite the rage and despair, he never left. He could not. By the end of the first week, the weight of his emotions began to reshape him. He realized he could no longer separate the man he was at work from the father and husband he had become in this hospital room. The carefully maintained image of control had cracked, and through the cracks poured grief, love, regret, and a strange kind of humility he had never allowed himself to feel. He began to see Sarah not as the woman who had left him, but as the woman he still loved, the mother of his daughter, a soul caught in a place between life and death who might still find her way back. And though he did not say it aloud, Michael began to understand that if she ever opened her eyes again, he would not demand answers or punish her for the pain of the past. He would take her hand and hold it as if it had never been gone, because the time lost between them could never be reclaimed. In that realization lay both his deepest sorrow and the fragile hope that kept him at her side. The second week in the hospital stretched into something that felt endless, a gray corridor of waiting where each hour brought no real change but somehow deepened the tension that lived inside Michael. He had long stopped checking his watch or asking his assistant for updates on his company. Those things belonged to another man, a version of himself that seemed almost unreal now. His days began with the sound of Emma's small footsteps in the hall, her yellow dress a flash of color against the sterile walls, and ended with her falling asleep beside her mother, her head resting on the edge of the bed. Between those moments stretched long hours where hope and despair clashed inside him like waves in a storm. The doctors spoke in careful voices, repeating the same refrains: "Her condition is stable, there is no significant improvement, we cannot predict the outcome." Each phrase was like a carefully measured dose of indifference meant to protect both them and him from disappointment. Michael despised the emptiness of those words, but he listened all the same, because they were all he had. He tried to pry meaning from every syllable, wondering if perhaps they knew more than they revealed, or if their detachment was simply another mask, like the one he had worn for years as a businessman who could not afford to show weakness. Through it all, Emma became the beating heart of the room. She brought drawings each morning, filling the walls with crooked rainbows and smiling stick figures of herself holding hands with two taller figures labeled Mom and Dad. She read fairy tales out loud, her voice stumbling over long words but never faltering in its devotion, as if each story carried the power to coax her mother back into the world. Sometimes she simply talked about ordinary things, the way the sun had looked that morning, the taste of the pancakes she had eaten, or the games she hoped to play once her mother came home. To Michael, those moments were both beautiful and unbearable, because every word carried an assumption he was too afraid to fully believe in, that Sarah would wake. At night, when Emma finally drifted into sleep, Michael was left alone with his thoughts, and it was then that the weight of the years fell hardest on him. He remembered the moment he had accepted that Sarah was gone, how he had buried her in silence without a funeral, without closure, convincing himself it was the only way forward. He remembered the lies he had told his daughter, not out of malice but out of fear that the truth would be too much for her to bear. And now he wondered if in doing so he had robbed them both of something essential, the chance to grieve honestly, to keep looking, to believe that miracles were possible. That guilt pressed on him until he could hardly breathe, and he found himself whispering apologies into the quiet room, apologies Sarah could not hear, apologies that were as much for himself as for her. There were moments, too, when he thought he saw movement, the flicker of an eyelid, the faint tightening of her hand beneath his. Each time he leaned forward with his heart in his throat, only to realize it was nothing more than the play of shadows or the twitch of a muscle. The disappointment cut deeper each time, but still he refused to stop watching. Even the illusion of life gave him something to cling to. He began to notice the small ways Emma's faith changed him, how her determination created a current he could not resist. When she told him with absolute certainty that her mother could hear her, he found himself nodding, even though the rational part of his mind rebelled. When she drew pictures of the three of them together, he tacked them to the wall without hesitation, as if by making them visible he could turn them into truth. As the days wore on, Michael began to recognize that the battle was not only Sarah's but his own. He was fighting against years of bitterness, against the armor of detachment he had built around himself, against the part of him that wanted to control every outcome. Here, in this small room filled with the sound of machines and the stubborn love of a child, he had no control. All he could do was sit, wait, and believe. And though the thought terrified him, he began to see that maybe this was the lesson he had been avoiding his entire life, that true strength was not measured in victories or wealth but in the willingness to hope when logic insisted hope was foolish. Each night, before leaving the hospital, he leaned over Sarah and pressed his forehead against her hand, whispering words meant for her alone. He told her about Emma, about how much their daughter needed her, about the stories she told and the pictures she drew. He told her about his own regrets, his failures, the way he had never stopped missing her even when he tried to convince himself otherwise. And each time he spoke, he felt the faintest shift inside himself, as though with every confession he was breaking down the walls that had kept him locked away for years. He did not know if Sarah could hear him, but he knew Emma was right about one thing: love had a way of reaching places that reason could never touch. It was late in the afternoon when the shift happened, though at first Michael almost missed it. The hospital room looked no different from the countless days before, washed in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above. Emma sat perched on the chair beside the bed, her legs swinging as she read aloud from one of her picture books, her small voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the story. Michael sat close enough to hear but not so close that she would feel watched, his mind drifting between the words she spoke and the heavy silence that surrounded Sarah. He had trained himself not to expect change, to steel his heart against the crushing disappointment that followed every false flicker of movement. Yet this time something was different. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Sarah's fingers twitch against the blanket, a motion so slight he thought it must have been another illusion, some trick of nerves. He leaned forward, holding his breath, and watched again. Emma noticed before he could say anything. She dropped the book to the floor with a soft thud, her blue eyes wide as she gasped. "Daddy, look!" Her small hand clasped her mother's, squeezing it with all the urgency she could muster. The fingers moved again, this time undeniably, curling faintly around Emma's. Michael's heart surged in his chest, pounding so loudly he thought it might drown out the beeping of the monitors. He reached for Sarah's other hand, gripping it tightly, and whispered her name with a desperation that shook every syllable. The machines picked up subtle changes, the rhythm of the beeping altering just enough to make the nurses outside rush in. The air filled with sudden urgency as the staff crowded around, their practiced calm laced with the hint of surprise. Michael barely heard their clipped instructions, their medical jargon exchanged in quick bursts. All of his attention was fixed on Sarah's face. Her eyelids fluttered, first weakly, then with more strength, as though she were fighting against an unseen weight. Each attempt made Michael's breath catch, his entire body trembling with anticipation and fear. Then, slowly, her eyes opened. They were clouded, unfocused, but unmistakably alive. For a moment she seemed lost, her gaze wandering across the ceiling, the machines, the unfamiliar faces of nurses leaning over her. But when Emma leaned closer, whispering, "Mommy, it's me," something changed. Sarah's eyes, though heavy with confusion, shifted and locked onto her daughter's face. Tears blurred Michael's vision as he watched Sarah's lips part, her voice no more than a broken whisper. "Emma." The sound was fragile, ragged from disuse, but it carried the weight of a miracle. Emma began to cry, her little body shaking with sobs that were not of fear but of overwhelming joy. She pressed her forehead against her mother's hand, her words tumbling out in a rush of relief, telling her she loved her, that she had been waiting, that she knew she would wake up. Michael felt his own tears spill freely, years of grief and anger dissolving in that single instant. He bent close, his hand tightening around Sarah's as he whispered her name again and again, each time more certain that she was truly there. The room buzzed with medical activity as the staff checked monitors, adjusted tubes, and spoke in urgent but steady tones. Yet for Michael, the noise faded into the background. All he could see was Sarah's gaze, weak but present, searching the faces of the people around her. When her eyes met his, time seemed to stop. There was no recognition at first, no spark of the past returning instantly, but there was a connection nonetheless. In that hazy, fragile moment, he knew that somewhere inside her, she understood she was not alone. As the doctors worked, Michael felt a tidal wave of emotions crash over him, relief so powerful it left him trembling, gratitude that bordered on disbelief, and fear that the miracle might slip away as suddenly as it had come. He pressed his lips to her hand, whispering promises he had never dared to speak before, that he would be there, that he would not let her go again, that they would face whatever came next together. Emma, still clutching her mother's fingers, nodded fiercely through her tears, as though echoing his vow with the pure force of her love. When Sarah's eyes closed again, not in the endless stillness of the coma but in the exhaustion of someone who had finally returned to the surface, Michael exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for 6 long years. The room seemed to shift around him, brighter, fuller, alive in a way it had not been before. He knew the battle was far from over, that recovery would be long and uncertain, but for the first time since the nightmare had begun, he allowed himself to believe. His daughter had been right all along, love had reached her mother where logic could not. And now, as he sat with one hand holding Emma's and the other still clasped tightly around Sarah's, Michael understood that he had witnessed not just a medical awakening, but the rebirth of hope itself. The days after Sarah's awakening were filled with a strange mixture of triumph and fragility, as though the entire world had been rebuilt on glass that might crack at the slightest misstep. Michael remained constantly at her side, watching as she slowly relearned how to open her eyes for longer periods, how to form words that had been locked away for years, and how to hold on to Emma's hand without slipping back into the haze of exhaustion. Each moment felt monumental, but each moment also carried with it the reminder of how much had been lost. Sarah's memories returned in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror that could not yet be put back together. Sometimes she recognized Emma instantly, whispering her name with a smile so tender it made Michael's chest ache, and other times she looked at her daughter with confusion, as if unsure how such a grown little girl could truly belong to her. Michael faced those moments with quiet strength, though inside he was often torn apart. He wanted desperately to protect Emma from the heartbreak of seeing her mother's uncertainty, but he also knew he could not shield her from the truth. Emma, however, was stronger than he realized. She refused to be discouraged, and when Sarah's gaze faltered or her memory slipped, Emma simply repeated her name, told her another story, or sang softly until recognition flickered again. Her persistence became the anchor of the room, pulling them all forward when despair threatened to drag them down. For Michael, the hardest part was confronting the ghosts of the past. There were nights when Sarah drifted into uneasy sleep and Emma dozed in the chair beside her, when he sat alone in the dim light of the hospital and allowed himself to think about the years of anger he had carried. He remembered the bitterness that had consumed him when Sarah disappeared, the way he had convinced himself she had abandoned them by choice, and the cruel relief he had tried to manufacture by declaring her dead in his heart. Now, with her fragile hand resting in his, he felt that anger dissolve, replaced by questions that haunted him with equal force. Why had she gone? What had truly happened to her? Would she ever be able to explain, or would the answers be lost forever in the haze of her damaged memory? As Sarah's strength returned, Michael began to realize that those questions, as much as they tormented him, no longer mattered in the same way. The woman lying in front of him was not the ghost of his past but the mother of his daughter in the present, fighting her way back into the world with every breath. He could not let old wounds poison what little time fate had given them now. One evening, when Sarah's eyes lingered on him longer than usual, a flicker of recognition softening into something like sorrow, he took her hand and whispered that whatever had happened before did not change what she meant to them now. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to respond, but no words came. Instead, a single tear slipped down her cheek, and Michael brushed it away gently, knowing that even silence could speak volumes. Emma's joy grew with each passing day, and her optimism became contagious. She began planning for the future as though it were already certain, talking about the games they would play in the garden, the family dinners they would share, and the bedtime stories Sarah would finally get to tell her. Michael listened with a mixture of fear and wonder, because he knew recovery was not guaranteed, yet he also realized that Emma's unwavering faith had carried them this far, and perhaps it would carry them even farther. By the time Sarah was strong enough to sit up in bed without assistance, Michael felt something shift inside himself. He no longer saw her as a fragile patient but as a partner, even in her weakness. He helped her with every small task, guided her through the simple exercises the doctors prescribed, and found himself marveling at her determination. The woman he had once loved had always been strong-willed, and though the accident had left her broken in body and mind, that strength still lived within her. It was in those moments, watching Sarah fight to return to her daughter, that Michael understood he was being given a chance at redemption. Not just the chance to rebuild a fractured family, but the chance to become the man he should have been all along, someone who measured wealth not by the height of his buildings or the size of his accounts, but by the love he gave and received. He did not yet know what their future would hold, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would never again let fear or pride stand in the way of the people he loved. The day Sarah was finally discharged from the hospital felt almost unreal, as if the walls that had contained their lives for so long had suddenly fallen away and revealed a brighter world waiting beyond. Michael guided her gently through the glass doors, his arm steady around her waist, while Emma skipped ahead in her yellow dress, carrying the flowers she had insisted on bringing to welcome her mother home. The sunlight outside was dazzling, too sharp after the muted glow of fluorescent lights, and Sarah paused for a moment, closing her eyes as though to let the warmth sink into her skin. Michael watched her with a mix of awe and fear, aware of how fragile she still was but also struck by the quiet strength it took for her to step back into life after hovering so long on its edge. The house felt different when they arrived, though nothing had changed physically. The same polished floors stretched across the entryway, the same high ceilings echoed faintly with their footsteps, but the presence of Sarah transformed everything. Where silence had once lingered, there was now a sense of possibility, a breath of life filling spaces that had grown hollow over the years. Emma dragged her mother from room to room, showing her drawings she had taped to the walls, toys she had saved, and the garden outside where she had spent countless afternoons imagining the moment when her family would be whole again. Sarah's eyes welled with tears at each small revelation, her hands trembling as she touched the artifacts of years she had lost. Michael followed quietly, his throat tight, realizing that Emma's relentless hope had preserved this moment for them long before he had dared to believe it could happen. In the evenings, they began to settle into a new rhythm, one that was imperfect but achingly human. Sarah grew stronger with each passing day, walking more confidently, speaking with greater ease, and piecing together fragments of memory that came to her like scattered shards of glass. Sometimes those memories brought pain, flashes of the accident or the years she could not explain, and Michael learned to comfort her without demanding answers. He understood now that the past would never be complete, but that did not matter as much as the present, where Emma curled between them on the couch as they read stories together, or where laughter finally returned to rooms that had gone too long without it. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden watching Emma weave flowers into a clumsy crown, Sarah turned to Michael with a look that silenced him before she spoke. Her voice was soft but steady when she said she did not know why life had led them through such darkness, but she believed it was because they needed to learn what truly mattered. Michael felt something inside him shift again, a final piece clicking into place, as he realized that the man he had been before her disappearance could never have understood this truth. He had once believed his empire was his greatest achievement, that control and wealth were the only measures of success, but now he saw with clarity that the empire he needed to protect was seated right in front of him, fragile and extraordinary, built not of stone or steel but of love. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Michael sat with Sarah and Emma at the garden table. Emma placed the uneven flower crown on her mother's head and declared her a queen, laughing when Sarah smiled shyly and played along. Michael looked at them both, his heart swelling with a gratitude so fierce it left him breathless. He thought back to the phone call that had shattered his world, the words of his daughter that had left him speechless, and he realized now that it had not been the beginning of the end but the beginning of something far greater. They had been broken, scattered, nearly destroyed, but together they had stitched themselves into a new story, one defined not by loss but by survival and rebirth. As night settled in and the first stars blinked to life above them, Michael wrapped an arm around Sarah and pulled Emma close to his side. For the first time in years, he felt no need to look beyond that moment, no desire to measure his worth against anything outside this circle of light and love. His daughter's laughter rang in his ears, his wife's hand rested warm in his own, and he knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The darkness had not won. It had only taught them how bright the light could be when it finally returned.